Okay, I think we need to get, it is 4 o'clock, correct?
Yes, it is.
All right. I'm just going to acknowledge who I see that is here. I see Bill Jane, I see Connie Parker, I see Eric Seidel with city staff, Aaron Reese with city staff, Dave Petrino, Megan Upchurch with city staff, Sean Evans, Demir Powell, and Christine Hughes with city staff, Tyler Newman, Melissa Huffman, and Glenn Harbeck, and Catherine Thurston with city staff. I see Allison. That's who I see, but I don't see everyone at one time. So if you have a question, I'm not going to be able to see a hand raised or anything with the way my setup is here at home. I see only see 3 or 4 people. If I try to expand it out to see the full list of participants, then I can't see the screen that I'm presenting. And I want to be able to talk into the camera and not turn my head, if that makes sense. We all have to be flexible with this stuff, right? All right. All right, well, I'm going to get started. It was like we have most of the folks who participated last time. Not everyone, but most of the folks are here. Wanted to use this time as a follow-up to that meeting. Couple of specific items we want to talk about are going to be essential site improvements, tree credits, tree mitigation, and then our proposal for water protected trees. Just keep our broad goal in mind. We are trying to balance tree preservation with growth and development. This area is going to grow. Whether we want it to grow or not, and how fast we want to grow, this area is going to grow. And so as properties are developed, we just need to keep in mind that we need to try to balance this growth and development with tree preservation, because we are hearing it from both sides. The need for the development community and others to build good quality projects, as well as the other side of it appears there's too many trees being removed in the city. So our goal as a city is to try to be as balanced as possible with this approach. So if we keep that in mind as we move forward. I've said that at the last meeting. I said that in the Planning Commission and City Council work session on January 26th. Now my slide's not advancing. Before I go into defining essential site improvements, we also did as a result of the work session on January 26th, as well as the conversation we had last month, we have looked more closely at what New Hanover County was approved in late 2020, and we have adjusted some of our proposal as a result of that conversation, and after we've had a little bit of opportunity to further study and identify what they've proposed. So I'll go through that in this presentation as well. So one of the things that we left untouched at the last meeting, we talked about it briefly, but didn't really go into detail, was what constitutes an essential site improvement. This picture was taken within the last week or two, and it is of the crossroads at Independence, where the Harris Teeter is being proposed there at Carolina Beach Road and Independence Boulevard. We've looked at that one because of phone calls we've received from citizens, emails we've gotten, and so forth about just the loss of trees. So that's why I chose to put this particular image. It's not picking on them. It's just it's more of a recent development that's occurred, and that's why I've chosen this image as something to look at as we look at that. So from our definition perspective, essential site improvements are those standards that are required to meet local regulations, to meet state regulations, and federal regulations. That could be building locations in some instances, as we proposed. It could be parking requirements. It could be where does the water line, the sewer line, and the stormwater have to go. those kind of things. So what we're trying to understand, and this is going to be an interactive discussion here. How do we address wholesale clear cutting, massive regrading, and leveling of a site, similar to what we've seen on the previous slide? We are flat area. I showed an image at the last meeting of our Walmart over on Sigmund Road versus Hilton Head Walmart, and the differences. And they were both built about the same time, late 90s, early 2000s. The building square footage are similar. But and I'm certainly not saying we have to be Hilton Head, and I don't want anyone to take that as what I've said. So I'm not trying to say we need to be Hilton Head, but I'm just using the example of they were able to work around trees. And the one over on Sigmund Road wasn't as successful in working around trees. Perhaps it's state guidelines. It could be state differences in state stormwater requirements. And we're trying to look into some of that. That allows, maybe South Carolina allows some different things than what our state allows or requires from a design perspective. So we're looking at that. But so can anyone who wants to jump in help us understand the wholesale clear cutting, massive regrading, and leveling of a site? Bill, I think I saw your hand raise.
Yes, sir.
I cannot see everyone, so if you do raise your hand and someone sees that someone has a hand raised, when Bill finishes, I apologize if I don't recognize you. I just don't see everyone the way my screen's set up.
Ron, one of the concerns I've had regarding definition of the essential site improvements is the location. Very often, it seems to me that there is some flexibility in terms of where a developer puts an improvement, say stormwater, even water or sanitary sewer. If Cape Fear Public Utility Authority requires a developer to put a pipeline, say sanitary sewer, in a specific location, then I can see that, yeah, you can't get around that in order to save a tree. But if there is flexibility, say with a storm sewer or even, with sanitary sewer, what kind of improvements or what kind of language do you think you'll try to put into the code itself to allow some flexibility to save a tree just by simply maybe moving a storm sewer or sanitary sewer to a maybe perhaps a little bit of a jog in the layout instead of directly straight?
Sure. And we do have some current language, Bill, in our code. I'm trying to find what we've kind of written so far. And it's not going to jump off the screen for me, or off the page. We have in our code, both current code and proposed code, written in flexibility to allow setback relief to save trees for buildings, modifications to our say maybe like a landscape island in order to save the trees. We have some shoot, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on our current code and I'm drawing a blank on what we're proposing. It's just not jumping off the page. We have flexibility though to allow buildings to be moved on the site, parking adjustments. Our current code, as an example, talks about how the city may require lowering the amount of parking space to the minimum that is required. Keep in mind, and you weren't part of the last meeting, we are proposing not to have minimum parking standards for properties outside for any commercial development, and only residential outside the 1945 corporate limits.
Does the city in the proposal or currently have negotiating authority to call on a developer to move an improvement, simply, to be more proactive, Ron, rather than just simply reactive and waiting for the developer to say, yeah, we'll move this. Can you go to the developer and say, we want you to move this?
We have language, both current and proposed code, that says the city may require or allow the following, and there's a list of criteria. And I may even have on a slide here. And I apologize because I get trying to remember new code, current code, new code, reviewing New Hanover counties. What did I put in this slide presentation? That slide presentation kind of gets, I get lost and forget all the details sometimes. So I do apologize for that.
Wow.
But we do have the flexibility written in our code to say, and it's written in a way that says the city may allow or require X, Y, Z.
Okay. Well, I think we'd like to see that beefed up a little bit more, even if possible, but that require, I think, we're concerned that, we don't want to see a situation where the builder or developer says, well, it's essential that I put my building here, no ifs, ands, or buts, and the city has no recourse.
Right. Some of you are familiar with what New Hanover County adopted with the car wash that occurred up there in Ogden. A lot of what they wrote in their code was language that we currently have in ours. So some of the flexibility that was written into their code to allow flexibility, the like reduce setbacks and those kind of things, we currently have in the city code. Couple of things to address that, and I do want to hear from the development side as well. Couple of things though is that we have used and when there's specific trees in the site plan that are my dog's getting ready to bark, sorry. I think my wife just came home. We have worked with developers before to save trees, I'd say a grove of trees when we have believed that they didn't have to design it exactly that way. We also do try to work with them earlier in the process, the way that we have changed our TRC review. We require a more robust pre-TRC consult. So before you submit your final plan, we are actually reviewing a preliminary plan that was more what our final plans were a year and a half ago. So we're having, and then when they submit the full plan, all the permits and so forth are in hand when they submit. So we're trying to achieve and get to things a little earlier in the process, if that makes sense.
Sounds good.
I'd like to hear from Dave or Tyler or Cameron or Allison or anyone who's on the call who may have from the developer's perspective of what you have to go through from either design or from construction. Is there anyone willing to speak on that?
Hey, Ron, I'll talk about that if you want. This is Allison.
Thanks, Allison.
Okay. So for those of you that may not know, I'm a land planner here in town, and I deal with the city's regulations all the time. And they're one component of all of the things that we have to do to get a site permitted and built under construction and then opened up. So the city code does allow a great deal of flexibility, like Ron has stated, but often the sites are very tight. Just because land is expensive and nobody wants to buy more land than they need to buy. So that is one of the things that we find a great challenge. And I told Ron this during the last call. I think the single best thing they've done to help trees and help the site move around a little bit is to reduce the parking standard. Parking often drives site design, so it is very, very crucial to tree save to be able to lessen that pavement so that we can move the building, move the parking, and address areas of the site that might have some nice trees that we think need to be saved. And that also helps us with our infrastructure, because what happens when you have parking across the entire site, you have to pick it up in storm drains. Or generally speaking, you pick it up in storm drains so that you can get it into a stormwater pond and meet all of the state requirements in that regard. So if we lessen our pavement, then we're lessening our infrastructure demand on the site. And I think that's probably going to help out. It'll be the single best thing to help out the overall goal of tree save.
Thank you for adding that, Allison. I forgot to mention that. Anyone else want to talk about, help us understand the this essential site improvement? Because we're not pretending that we got it right.
I'll jump in real quick.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
And it's really, I mean, Allison kind of hit on it, but not all sites are the same, right? If you go back to the previous slide, the trees that were on that site prior to it being developed, I'm guessing that they removed trees on that site in compliance with the city ordinance. Otherwise, they would probably not be working out there right now. And presumably it wasn't filled with live oaks. It's a site on Carolina Beach Road in Independence where a bunch of pine trees are. And I think that's the larger issue in my mind. And it's what I kind of reached out to Ron about is I think there are probably some main pockets of trees on undeveloped sites that are going to be the thrust of the regulations here in the future. This isn't really a CBD discussion. It's not really a discussion about the port or UNCW. It's not really a discussion about residential lots less than an acre. It's really kind of in the commercial corridors is where most of this discussion is going to be, because it's where people drive by and see things that are in process, like this Harris Teeter right here, that in my mind, those folks are going to eventually shop there when it gets built.
And some feedback that I've gotten from some folks are, if you ride by the intersection, I think it's called Progress Point, but it's where PT Grill is. There's a CVS at Military Cutoff Road and Eastwood Road. You drive by it, you see the nice trees along the street. You go by Lumina Station, you see the nice street yard of the trees that are planted and the trees that were saved along the street. So it's almost as if we have to have the mass grading like this, Tyler, that you were talking about, and Allison, to comply with regulations, what about the street frontage? So the trees that, and maybe there wasn't, I don't know this site specifically, so I don't know what was along the streets, the type of trees, but that's a curb line. Right here, if you can see what my cursor is. So that's the actual curb line. None of the trees here along the streets were saved. So if there was a 30-foot swath of trees along the perimeter there, then at least it lessens the I don't know what I'm trying to say. If the veil of trees were there along the front, then it doesn't look so drastic of a change behind it. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
It's the visual impact.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The impact in the back still occurred, but it's not as drastic or not as immediate to see. So that may be something we're still going to pursue. By our code, if trees are in the street yard, they are required to be saved. Unless unless there are some essential site improvements that needs to occur. So again, that's what we're trying to figure out. What we know these things. We know there's things that a developer has to do to comply with the rule, minimum standard from the city, or to put in a stormwater pond, or to put in water sewer. The sewer has to be in a low part of the area, a low part of the property. But how do we get there? So,
Ron, if I could just jump in just for a second, and I think the visual impact is very, very important too. But I think we'd really like to be able to see the developers look at trees and groves of trees, stands of trees. They don't need to be all beautiful specimen live oaks or longleaf pines, but if they're healthy and in the right location, they can do a lot to help control stormwater. I know, North Carolina State, for example, has got a program in their, I think it's environmental engineering, that writes an awful lot and gives an awful lot of examples of how to use trees and other more environmentally friendly kind of features to help control the stormwater rather than just simply taking out virtually every living plant and grading the site in order to dump everything into a pond. And, maybe this in the old regime here, maybe the requirement for more parking or something on the Harris Teeter site that you showed the picture of may have had a big impact, but, hopefully in the future they'll have more flexibility. But yeah, we would like to really make the point that trees are not just obstacles. They can be resources and assets to the developer.
Ron, could I throw something in here?
Sorry, yes, I was muted.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the removal of trees, but one of the things that the code also has is a pretty robust requirement to plant trees back. So while the site looks like it's just completely a moonscape right now, I think the one thing that we should talk about is what does get put back. And, maybe it's that if a site is clear cut like that, for whatever reason, there is another requirement to beef up the street yard when it gets planted back. I don't know what the trade-off is, but I don't know what their reasons were for clear cutting that, but sometimes it may be appropriate to do so and then put something better back.
Yeah, and I think in this particular site, there was some contours actually that existed on this property and that were created some of it. Our code requires current and proposed would be still to plant back 15 trees per disturbed acre. There still would be street yard requirements. We won't call it street yard, but it's the same thing. Still be called still street yard requirements. Parking lot landscaping, foundation plantings, any buffer required, those kind of things are still going to be retained in our code. We're talking about on major corridors where the frontage requirements, where we have frontage standards. So Carolina Beach Road, if this is a suburban type street front, are there additional type of street yard plantings that we should be requiring as a gateway into our community? There are some things, Allison, I think is what you're trying to hit at, is that there are trees being replaced. What I hear on the other side is that developers, our code only requires, say, a 2 or 3 inch tree to be put back when maybe it's a 16-inch tree or a bunch of larger trees that are being removed. I will go over some mitigation factors here in a few minutes in our presentation. Also, we'll go over tree credit. That's because that's something we talked about and something that you guys had asked us to look a little bit more into what New Hanover County had adopted versus what we currently have and what our proposal is. So I've taken some notes. I think Megan has probably taken better notes than me, but I'm going to move on if that's okay with the group. And if we need to come back and talk about another topic, I just want to try to keep the presentation moving. Something I probably should have said at the beginning is we are going to be putting out a draft for public inspection of our entire land development code. That's all of the articles that we've already released, plus landscaping and signage are the only two articles that we haven't really released for public inspection on April 1st. That is our deadline. We are going to meet that deadline. So what that means is that after this conversation today, We're going to take the information we learned at the last meeting from the work session with Planning Commission, City Council, as well as what we gathered today, and we have to put something on paper so we can move forward and meet our deadline. That does not at all mean, though, that public comment period stops. So at that point, we'll be releasing the full draft, and the public vetting process will continue. In a lot of ways, it's the first time that either group, and neither one of the development community nor the tree community has seen our tree proposal. I think we've gone in pretty good detail of what we're proposing, so I don't think there'll be any surprises. But you haven't actually seen it in a document form. So we understand that. I don't want anyone to walking away from this meeting that they weren't listened and we didn't hear what you said. And we put something out, it's written in stone, and so and we're not. The public vetting process will continue, but we have to meet this deadline. I hope everyone understands that. So I'm gonna move to the next grouping of slides. This is just a real quick snapshot for what the city currently has in our code for regulated and significant trees. So 4-inch, I'm going to generalize 4-inch regulated tree for flowering trees, 8-inch for hardwoods, and 12-inch for conifers. For our significant trees, it's 8-inch for flowering and American hollies. It's 24-inch for hardwoods and 3 specific types of pines, including the longleaf pine, and then non-pine conifers, and then 32 inches for all other pines. So this is the city's current code. As requested, we looked a little harder at what New Hanover County has proposed or had adopted last year. So they call what we currently call a regulated tree, they call a documented tree. And it's 4 inches for flowering American hollies, 8 inches for hardwoods, longleaf pine, and bald and pond cypress, and then 12-inch for all other conifers. Significant trees. If you notice, like the city's current code is 24 inches for hardwoods and the longleaf pines and the non-pine conifers. They are 18 inches for hardwoods, longleaf pines, and the pond and bald cypress. They also, it says sweet gums when they are located with required vegetative buffer areas or open sides. So only if you have a sweet gum that is when a required vegetative buffer area or open space set aside, are they counted as a significant tree. And then they have the specimen tree category that we talked about briefly last time at 36 inches for live oaks, pond, and bald cypress. The next slide I'm going to show you is what we're proposing, and I think I've identified the differences in red here. So for regulated trees, the same as New Hanover County has currently adopted. For significant trees, we're proposing now, instead of our 24-inch currently, going to 18 inches for the hardwoods, longleaf pine. Hold on, I got to plug my computer in. Longleaf pine. We have the difference here. We have Pocosin pine and the black pine tree as a significant tree at 18 inches. And then our specimen tree category, we are proposing in the city at 24 inches. And the difference is New Hanover County, if you see, does not include longleaf pines, and we are proposing longleaf pines. The same requirements, if you have a specimen tree and you want to remove it, it would go to the Board of Adjustment. So just for transparency, the difference between the city on the type of protected trees would be from between our code and the county code. These two type of pine trees is significant at 18 inches. And the specimen tree at 24 inches versus 36. And then we've added longleaf pine versus, I think they just had the live oak and the 2 cypress trees. So that is what we're proposing, unless something changes between now and next week. So any comments on that as we move forward?
Ron, this is Aaron. Just one point for clarification. Pocosin pine that you have in red right there is the same as pond pine in the regulated category. Pocosin and pond pine are kind of interchangeable, but it's the same species.
Yeah, and I think in our code, it actually has one of the other words in parentheses, and I don't know why I didn't use the same terminology here. Appreciate that
Yeah.
clarification.
Yeah, either one works. Just want everybody to understand it's the same tree.
But can you explain for all of us here, though, why what's the significance of a pond pine and black pine? Why are they in the same category as a longleaf pine? Because I think most of us understand the importance and how native the longleaf pine is, and how prevalent it is here. Can you explain why the Pocosin pine and black pine are in that same category?
Yeah, the black pine is just kind of I think that's a carryover from current code. Black pine's not really a naturally occurring tree, but it's a popular landscape tree. So I think that's why it got picked up. But the Pocosin pine is predominantly the species that you're going to see in the Carolina Bay areas, because it's a pine species that can tolerate the high water table and periodic wet and dry nature of Pocosin, the Pocosin environment in the Carolina Bays. So in the city limits of Wilmington, there are several areas that were the natural Carolina Bay areas. Then the vegetation in those bays is very distinct. They're more or less not really a macro ecosystem, but they're just about, they're kind of an ecosystem in and of themselves, just like a bald cypress swamp. Once you get into these Carolina Bays, they're very much a different area, and they're for North Carolina, the eastern North Carolina, they're kind of a regional thing. It's not something that you find all over the country, and there's a reason they're called a Carolina Bay. They are naturally occurring areas, and the pond pine or Pocosin pine, whichever one you want to call it, is just the predominant pine species that you find in those areas with all the other, water loving, almost swamp type plants. And you very, very seldom see those pines outside of Carolina Bay areas, areas that currently are or were previously part of a Carolina Bay. So that's why they're called out differently than the other species.
What area of town is that?
Probably the biggest area in town would be, let's see, kind of centers around, it's one of the biggest ones. The center of it would, before it was all disturbed and cut up by roadways and development and everything, the center of it would have been roughly maybe a little bit offset from the intersection of 17th and Independence. So down there where the art museum would have been to one edge of it, and then the housing development kind of south of the art museum. All of or at least the lower half, the front half of the new Barclay development, going on over into quite a few acres on the northwest corner of that Independence 17th intersection. Just making a big circle around that intersection pretty much. That was one of the bigger ones, and there's there's a couple more that are somewhat defined in town, but that's probably the biggest one. That's probably the easiest one to reference.
Thanks. That's helpful. I mean, one of the things I was asking.
Yeah, go ahead. I was gonna say a lot of these it's my understanding, back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of them were actually trenched and drained to try to make the property useful. And now a lot of it has since been developed. So.
Right. So I think, and that was what I was thinking. the answer probably was. I live in Glenmead. If I walked outside, there are probably, I don't know, 30 longleaf pine trees in my front yard that are close to that specimen level. And, I think there are pockets around town that kind of hit some of these things. And I was trying to get my arms around, what is where, and try to quantify it that way so we can kind of talk about what we're saving and what the intent is, and then also what's getting built back, and what's being put in when it gets built back. I kind of think about the front half of UNCW where they've got the longleaf out there along the frontage, and then they've gone back in and put in smaller ones. Obviously, the life cycles of those trees are hundreds of years, but when we're looking at the canopy, it's not fixed. So knowing what is where, I think, is as important as anything else.
Yeah, there's a lot of small areas, Pocosin areas, smaller Carolina Bay areas scattered out throughout town. So it's not, there's 2 or 3 big areas, really large areas, large acreage areas that would have been Carolina Bays, but there's also a lot of pockets, the little Pocosin swamp areas. Over around Live Oak Bank, there's a decently good sized area, kind of behind Live Oak Bank, and like the Reader Flytrap Garden, all back in that area, would have been a pocket. And there's several other ones, and there's ones that are even, there's little pockets that are, an acre or less. So there's little wetland pockets like that scattered all over town. So I mean, you get a decently, this is a broad area. The where you're going to find those pond pines and the associated vegetation. It may be scattered out over some of the bigger areas, but there's also small pockets that contain sizable trees. So it's not specifically one area. So they are scattered, and it's a lot more than what you might imagine.
All right, thanks for that information, Aaron. Bill, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Ron, and maybe you're going to cover this later on, but I wanted to bring up at this point the question of protection for City of Wilmington heritage trees. I've suggested that maybe they could be treated, and not all of them, but because some of them are groups and so on. But the heritage trees might be treated as specimen trees, for example. I don't know if you cover that later on in the presentation, but
we don't cover it, Bill. I do know that there's something that you had submitted as some feedback, 2-3 weeks ago now, or at least it was following that last meeting.
right.
We've talked about it. Primarily Megan and I have talked about it a little bit. It's a great program, and I think at least per our website, there's 60 listings, roughly 60 listings of heritage trees on the website.
Maybe more than that at this point, but yeah.
Yeah, I think at least when I went back after receiving your information, at least that's what was on the website.
Okay.
Good portion of those are on like city right of way or public properties. I'm thinking the Airlie Oak as an example.
Right.
Some of those are on private properties, single family home lots, and those kind of things. Those on the tree commission and Alliance for Cape Fear Trees and others on the call may know more than me on this, or more. I'm wondering if we were to market that program and told a resident, for example, that if your tree is listed as a heritage tree, not only do you get the honor of calling it a heritage tree and marketing that way, maybe there's signage or whatever goes on your property. But now if you want to remove that tree, even you would have to go through a board of adjustment process. I wonder if that would steer folks away from maybe approaching the tree commission to have their tree as a heritage tree. I don't know that, but we have not included it in our proposal at this time, but we have been talking about it.
Well, yeah, I think all your points are well taken, and I know that we did lose one tree that was perhaps thought to be on public property, but it wasn't. It was on private property near the Sweeney water treatment plant. And that was taken out by a contractor, I think, who was working on the treatment plant, and they used it as a kind of a lay down yard for materials and so on. So those are the kinds of things that I was really concerned about.
Right. And go ahead, Connie. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to comment from being the chair of the tree commission a couple of years that there are people who are afraid to, not necessarily for themselves, because they would not, if they own a property, they worry about the chance that when they sell the property, they can't sell it if there is something attached to a tree that will not allow the next owner to do anything with it. So there is some reluctance about that, that part of it.
Right.
Yes, and also I will say that there's also some reluctance about being named a heritage tree from some landowners or homeowners, just because they're afraid that if it's listed and there is a tour on the website, which there is a tour on the city website, that they do not want people coming around and looking at their tree. So there's several reasons that make it a little bit of a problem, as you have already identified, Ron.
Right. And the other thing Megan and I talked about, and I failed to mention that, was what would you do with those existing 60 or whatever the number is, you know, who they
Right.
entered the program without knowing that there were. So that's the main reason, Bill, why we've decided not to try to touch it with this draft. Doesn't mean that it's not something can't be pursued later if that's the blessing or wishes of council and others. But from what we're trying to accomplish with this, we have had some conversations on, is it the right thing to do or not? So just for that transparency. All right, so I'm going to move on. Was any other conversation on this slide from anyone? Again, I can't see, so if you have your hand raised or whatever, I can't see. But only folks I can see actually are Bill, Connie, and Aaron. So I can't see the others. So if there's any, I'm going to take silence as move forward. All right, exempting special situations. Many of you saw this slide last time. The main change here is we are proposing to add properties that are zoned multi-dwelling or multi-family to that exemption list. Again, the two pictures there, both of those pictures are single family homes, detached homes. One of them is zoned multifamily, the other one is not. So if kind of the idea is treat single family the same. Again, we looked at New Hanover County's code, where our code currently exempts single family homes or zone residential that are 2 acres and less. New Hanover County is 1 acre. And so we are proposing to be consistent with them and lower that to 1 acre. Our numbers show that's about a 3% difference. So roughly of the single family zone, I'm not talking residential, the single family, the R districts, there's 98% of the R districts are zoned with a single family home on it are under 2 acres. 95% of them are under 1 acre. So it's not that big of a difference, but there is some of a difference. And then again, we want to make sure that it's clear that in our code that if a tree is in a conservation resource, even though it may be residentially zoned and maybe under 1 acre, it is not exempt from the tree standards. That's something we in practice, we've been doing that, but it's not real clear that is the case. We want to make it sure that it's clear and understood. All right. We also looked at New Hanover County's tree credits and compared ours. The bullets there, we want to clarify that the credits are for non-protected trees and non-invasive trees. We talked a little bit more detail last time about the non-invasive trees, invasive trees and not treating them differently than other trees. You can use your credits to offset any required mitigation. And you can also, if there's any spading or transplanting of trees, then you get credits for those. The chart there, for those of you that were involved with helping New Hanover County come to consensus and get adopted, that is our attempt to take their 4 or 5 bulleted lists for tree credits and to put it in a chart. Megan and I looked at it and talked about it for about a good half hour yesterday afternoon to make sure that we've interpreted it correctly. We'll still continue to do that, but we believe the chart, the table reads better than 4 or 5 paragraphs. So, so the intent there is that if you have if a specimen tree is being removed, but you have a native trees that are being saved, then you get a 1-to-1 credit. 1 inch for every tree that is saved, you can apply towards any specimen tree that may have been removed and is required for mitigation. And their code, and we're proposing, would be 1.5 inches for significant trees. And we had to think of, on our end, we had to think about what's the difference? Well, I think the difference in my mind anyway is that you get more credit for significant tree, because if it comes down to it, they wanted the specimen tree saved. So you get less credit towards the specimen tree. That's how we've, in our mind, that's how we've, that's why we think there's a difference. So I know some of you were involved with the review of the county's ordinance for that. So again, this is our attempt to put in a table what their code says. Any comments? I don't want to go through every single one of them, but and if we'll continue to look at it to make sure that ours that it makes sense on and is consistent with theirs. And I may send it to Rebecca to have her take a real quick look at it. Hearing none, I'm going to move on to the next. This is mitigation. Last time I talked a little bit more about current code. This time I just want to talk just kind of what we're proposing, which is not really a lot of change from what I showed last time. I did have an example. So for significant and specimen trees, if you remove a 36-inch live oak as an example, we double the inches that you remove and you put back 72 inches. So that's how the significant and specimen tree mitigation works. And it's my review of the county's ordinance that is similar. They have a 2-to-1 ratio on the for specimen and significant trees. Something we are proposing, our current practice, and something we're proposing, which is different than New Hanover County, is we do require mitigation for regulated trees. If you remember the chart earlier about what the regulated trees are, and it's on a 1-to-1 ratio based on the whether if it's a native tree, it's a 1-to-1. If it's a non-native tree, it's 75%. And then if it's an invasive tree, you don't have to mitigate it. Again, with the conversation about invasive trees last time. Like the county, we are saying use the same or a comparable species. Tyler, I think that's what you might have been talking about earlier about replacement of if you remove a live oak, you put back a live oak or something similar. If you move a longleaf pine, you replace something similar. And instead of our current code has a minimum 144 square feet for a tree growth area. We are proposing to base for a minimum growing area and soil volume based on the tree size and tree species. A mature tree example would have more than a smaller tree. Just retaining protected trees, still requiring, unless you were exempt, permit for trees that are larger than 4 inches DBH or larger. We still would require tree protection fencing. This is some of the adjustments that I was trying to remember earlier some of the flexibility that I couldn't remember. So we do allow some adjustments for topographic reasons to our setbacks for buildings and so forth, parking adjustments where we do have a minimum standard, minimum maximum standard, and then landscaping size flexibility. That could be a street yard, it could be a landscape island, those kind of things. So we are planning to retain flexibility in our code to allow trees to be opportunities for trees to be protected and saved on properties. That's kind of concludes this particular presentation. I don't know if there's anything else we need to talk about. If we want to go back and talk about topics that we've talked about today, any other information that y'all would like for us to consider as we finalize this draft early next week.
Ron, let me just bring up one more thing. Something we've been concerned about is the loss of especially longleaf pines on small lots and residential lots, even, smaller than an acre. A lot of longleaf pines have been taken out because tree companies go around and in effect sell the removal of the pines because they tell the homeowners that they're not safe. And we'd like to see some sort of protection if possible for those trees. I'm not quite sure how you would do it. It certainly would be not easy to do, but we feel like an awful lot of them are being lost needlessly because people are not well informed, first of all, even about what's a longleaf pine versus any other kind of pine. And, another kind of pine might be more of a hazard, but a longleaf, because of its special attributes, is not as much of a hazard. So that's been a concern of ours.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that, Bill. We'll look into that. I don't know how we would approach that because, as you said, homeowners don't know what a lot of. I have pine trees in my yard. I couldn't tell you. I know they're not longleaf pines, but I don't know what type of pines they are out there. So I think a lot of homeowners don't know that.
Right.
I'm impressed that Tyler knew that he had probably 30 in his yard. So.
I will say, excuse me, I was going to say, because Tyler lives near where I live, and it's hard to, after you live there a year or two, to not appreciate what you got as a longleaf pine with the big pine cones and the long needles. But one of the things that he probably knows, and I do too, is that our interest from the Alliance aspect is how communities like his and mine were originally longleaf pine forests, and they have big long tap roots. The trees are 100 years old, and yet people don't understand the difference. And if they're new, especially, but not necessarily people who live here don't know the difference either, who've lived here forever. But we'll come in and you'll see in our neighborhood, well, over near the hospital and back of the hospital, which was wonderful pine forest. And there'll be one lot completely cleared of longleaf pines, and the next lot with beautiful stands of longleaf pines, and then two more without any trees. It really does affect the tax base. I want to tell you that, because it makes you not want to be in those houses. So just that's one of the reasons, Bill, we're trying to figure out as a group, as an alliance, what we can do to educate people about that. But just wanted to point it out. It wasn't something that just cropped up for no reason.
Sure. No, I appreciate the background on that. And just for the group's knowledge, we, as a staff, within the last month, sent out pamphlet brochures to tree companies as well as to our area HOAs to educate them, let them know that the city does have some permitting requirements and here's what they are. And so we're hoping that's going to get the tree companies that we're aware of. Obviously, when a storm comes in, we get tree companies from everywhere. And I know a lot of those are sometimes they're the ones knocking on the doors and convincing a property owner they need to get a tree removed before the next storm comes in. But the tree companies locally that we've identified we're all sent mailers as well as the HOAs that we could find addresses for mailing of what our tree permitting requirements are. So we're trying to do a little better job too on our end to educate anybody on this. So, any other things anybody want to bring up that we haven't talked about, or any additional information on what we have talked about? Any feedback on what I presented today? All right, I'm not seeing anybody's hand raised or anything, so. All right, so again, we have to meet our deadline, which is April 1st, which is what, 20 days away now, 21 days away or so. But we need to get our draft wrapped up for this as well. The other draft on signage that we're working out early to mid next week to give our time to reconcile everything and to put everything, get all our images put in and everything. So please don't take it as this ends the public vetting process. I know I said that earlier, but I want to make sure I continue to say that. I don't want anyone to walk away to think that there's not additional opportunities for feedback. So it still has to go through public hearing process. I'm sure there'll be a couple of work sessions with our council and planning commission, and ultimately council has to consider it for adoption. All right, anything else? I don't hear any, so I'm going to thank everyone for their participation, and I'm sure you guys are looking forward to receiving this so you can start reviewing it. So we're ready to get it off our desk. I promise you.
Ron.
What's that?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you.